Trauma is experienced by many regions around the world. Have you ever wondered how some regions of the world are addressing trauma in their communities? How do communities affected build strength and heal after difficult times? How do we adapt Western trauma treatments to fit a non-Western and local community? And what are some example innovations and strategies that are being used right now to build such treatment programs? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sun. Our guest today is Djavila Ho, a licensed associate clinical psychologist who has worked in clinical practice spanning both public and private settings in Kingston, Jamaica. She is an executive director of Kale Journey, a nonprofit organization with the vision of creating trauma-informed Caribbean societies, and presently serves as the president of the Jamaican Psychological Society. As a senior associate at KAD Morgan and Associates, her practice focuses on adolescent and adult trauma and stress-related disorders, grief, and mood disorders. She has a passion for mental health policy and initiatives focused on developing accessible, affordable, and high-quality trauma-informed mental health care. She sits on the President and Elders Committee of the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations, is co-chair of the Global Mental Health Steering Committee in the APA's Global Psychology Alliance, and is an international affiliate member of the American Psychological Association. As a Caribbean mixed-race Black psychologist, Djavila will be sharing a real-world example of college journey and culturally adapting the Community Resilience Model, or CRM, which is an evidence-based treatment. Djavila, thank you so much for being on our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jack. I really appreciate it.
My gosh, I am mesmerized by the involvement in the field of psychology that you're doing in Jamaica. It's like, wow, I actually was not aware that there was a psychological association there.
Oh yes, absolutely. Many years now. So quite a lot has been happening since then. I'm actually technically on the end of my term as president of the society, but it has been quite, really a great and rewarding experience being involved. So it's a professional society for all psychologists and counselors in the island, but also representing the diaspora. We do have international members who can join. So we do have Jamaicans who are overseas who may join the society and get involved, in the work that's happening here. So that's a really great opportunity for those overseas, but also for those here to kind of make connections as well.
Yeah. Well, I hope when folks are listening to this episode, they sign up as members.
I hope so too.
Yeah. I mean, we are so insulated here in the States. I'm guilty of it, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast to network and really spread the word that folks are doing. So let's talk a little bit more about your organization's adaptation process of the community resilience model. First of all, what is the community resilience model?
So, well, it's interesting how I sort of even learned about it, because it was at one of these APA conventions. The founder really of Kale and my co-executive director, Dr. Kai Morgan Campbell, she and I were in a presentation on the community resilience model and its applicability and its use in another country. So it was somewhere outside of the States. I don't recall where it is now. But we sat and we saw this description of a model, which really just utilizes 6 easy to learn skills that help persons to regulate their responses to trauma, right? And to help build resilience. They're easily transferable. So, you can teach your friend how to do it. It doesn't have to be from a clinician. You do not have to go to private practice to learn these skills. It's really just using these 6 skills, and you can choose one. You don't have to necessarily even use all of them, and using them to build resilience in communities. And so in its sort of original dispensation, they would teach and train trainers, so that they could continue the work once, the persons had left that community. And it's the same concept here, right? We want persons to learn these skills but be able to just share them, whether informally or even more formally, whether it's, teachers who have learned the skills and are teaching them to their students, but then those students can go on and, tell their friends, tell their families. And again, that's sort of growing the resilience in that community or in that space that, people are operating in. And so we thought about it and we said, okay, this model, it's based on the neurobiology of trauma. So it's not specific necessarily to any particular culture, because our neurobiological responses to trauma are relatively similar, right? There's the emotional dysregulation that's going to happen, right? But we thought, okay, the terms in this model don't really, they don't really resonate with our people. The layperson doesn't know what tracking means, for example, which is one of the first skills. And so we took a look at the model and we said, okay, we thought it would be important to bring this to Jamaica and to begin to implement it. But how can we adapt it in a way that is culturally relevant to our people?
Now, may I interject here first? So why did you feel that it was important to bring that to Jamaica?
When we think about trauma is not exclusive, right? Everyone experienced a traumatic experience at some point in their life. And when you look at Jamaica, and I think globally, a lot of times it's, people know Jamaica as, okay, it's a great, lovely, beautiful island with beaches and so forth, but there's also high levels of crime and violence. And, we think about crime and violence as one aspect of trauma, but there are many other things. I mean, high rates of motor vehicle accidents. We are prone to natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, and things like that. And then also just some of the more everyday, quote unquote, smaller things that we don't necessarily think about as traumatic. There is ongoing emotional abuse that people may experience, and of course, physical and sexual abuse as well. And so we have high rates of all of these things, but the interventions are still limited and inaccessible in a lot of ways, despite many efforts to bring about interventions and clinics and services. And so we thought this is one more way of trying to bring something that's accessible to the population. It does not require going to, the way we've done it as well, it does not require, as I mentioned, going to any particular facility to learn the skills, right? They're easy to learn. You can just tell someone else about it. And so we thought that this would be an important way of increasing the accessibility to skills that can help to build resilience in our population. Whether you've experienced a traumatic, or a chronic stress, let's say, you can learn how to cope with that, and you can help teach others how to cope with some of that, right? Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it's a treatment, but it's also preventative, because you already can learn the skill, and therefore, when something happens, you can assess yourself and maybe know how to what skill you may want to use to help address that feeling or that experience.
Yeah, there's an acknowledgement that trauma exists, regardless of culture. And of course, the event, some of these are events that happen to us, some of which is within the community, some of it like, motor vehicle accidents or, hurricanes, like climate change, those type of things. Some of it is more directly, what's the word I'm looking for? Man-made. The other is a little bit more removed. Things like, family violence, but even, maternity, mortality, these type of issues. I mean, trauma is everywhere. And so you're taking a very broad view of trauma and also thinking about how to make the community more resilient. Essentially, that's what the model is. It's like, hey, we're going to experience trauma. And so how do we face trauma through resilience? And you're building those skills. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you brought up a very clear example, like, the word tracking and changing the terminology. So walk us through Kali's journey and adapting this model.
Right. So we reached out to the originators and got their permission. And then we began to just kind of go through the model itself. So we went through each of the 6 skills and we renamed them. So we came up with some more Jamaicanized names, using patois, using some common Jamaican slang. So for example, the first skill in the CRIM model is tracking. For us, it's called check yourself, which it's essentially checking in with yourself, right? We have another one, which should be equivalent to in the CRIM model, it's grounding. For us, it's hola meds, which is literally, it translates to hold a meditation, but it's really just kind of taking a moment to kind of meditate, right? Or to take a moment to kind of ground yourself and get back to a sense of peace, right? But those are common Jamaican slangs or terms that, again, would resonate and be relevant to our population, right? People will easily recognize, okay, that's kind of what it's telling them to do. So we renamed them. And then we said to ourselves, okay, how would we want to deliver this information? Because the truth is typically, okay, maybe you'd try and create a workshop or some kind of presentation at the school, and go in and do some of these things. But we thought in the initial sense, well, those are things that we want to do and have done in some regard. What we want to do is maybe create a video series. In this day and age of social media and the internet, this is where a lot of people are getting their information, right? It also increases the reach because, again, I don't have to necessarily travel across the island to deliver the presentation. People can access this on our YouTube page, right? And so we decided we'd create a video series, which meant that we would have to explain what each of these skills were. And so we created a little script for the video series. And so it goes through each of the 6 skills, but it also starts off with an introductory video, which really is just sort of orienting everybody to concept of trauma, the impact of trauma on our brain, of course, with graphics and so forth to make it a little more engaging, and then how trauma impacts us in our daily lives, whether that's how we're thinking, how we're feeling, or how we might behave, right? Giving examples again that are relevant and people understand. And so that's sort of setting the groundwork as to why we even want to use these skills and how they're going to be helpful to us.
Wow.
Right?
Now, this video series, so Kale has it on your website?
It's linked to our website and it's on our YouTube page.
Oh, fantastic. We're going to share it. We're definitely going to share it because I think there's another, comment or something that I'm aware of is that a lot of the resources that people are getting on the island are actually not videos or produced by people on the island. So, right. So some of the stuff about trauma, it doesn't resonate or it may not be applicable. So exactly. I really want to make this available. Yeah.
Thank you. And apart from creating the script, again, the script is using, it's interspersing English and Jamaican patois. So we're using terms and vernacular that people will understand and relate to. We've included some popular Jamaican personalities, so people that they will recognize. They don't know us necessarily, right? But they will recognize some of these persons. We've also included younger people. So we have some children and teenagers who are involved. And it's really the clinician and I said clinician because all the members of the Cali team are involved in the video and we're all clinicians. But it's the clinician and this, popular personality having a conversation about what the skill is and then, giving examples and demonstrating some of them. So really engaging the viewer and helping persons to not just understand intellectually, but learn what it is they can do and maybe even follow along with us, right? Another thing that we've done and ensured with these videos is that they're inclusive. So there is closed captioning. And we also have a picture-in-picture JSL or Jamaican Sign Language translation. So again, trying to make sure that this is inclusive because trauma is not exclusive, right? And we're recognizing populations that tend to get left out of some of the conversation. And especially when it comes to mental health, get left out of a lot of the interventions because, not a lot of practitioners know Jamaican Sign Language. We do have a few, but not a lot. And so the access to mental health care can be very limited, especially if you don't have an interpreter or can't afford to have an interpreter, right? So that is definitely a couple of the key things that we've tried to incorporate and ensure were in the video series as we try to communicate these skills.
Wow. Well, what a huge undertaking. I mean, you're really connected with the community. Like you said, you're going to the schools, going to hospital systems, going in clinics, and you're also creating the visibility online because that is how a lot of younger generations are getting their information. So providing the educational content from reputable sources, I think is amazing that y'all are targeting this sort of multifaceted and making this reach. And also navigating between Jamaican slang, is that the word? Jamaican slang, and then also...
Or patois.
Say that again?
Patois.
Patois.
So that's or local, yeah. So that's like a local dialect that we have, very, a mixture of, our African ancestry as kind of mixture, yeah.
Wow. And then so mixing that and creating the videos and also the words, thinking, oh wait, what does grounding mean? What's another word that can really reflect that? Wow, it's very intentional thinking through these meanings. So what else would you like to share about this adaptation process?
So, I mean, as you mentioned, it was quite an undertaking because I think as clinicians, we learn these models or we learn these skills and we don't always think about how to translate it in a way that is really meaningful to the listener and to our clients sometimes even. We get very used to using our jargon very easily. I might even be doing some of it right now, but the average person, doesn't relate to that. They'll have to look up what some of these terms mean and how we're even using it, because it may be unique to psychology. So translating some of the skills and the strategies was an interesting undertaking, because we had to make sure that this made sense. And so we did sort of, very informally touch base with, again, a lot of the youth, because when we're thinking about slang and that's more relevant, we're not as young as we like to think we are. And so we may not necessarily know what would really resonate with them. And so these weren't always the first option. Right. We went through a couple of terminologies to make sure that this feels like it means, what it's supposed to mean. And when we speak about how to do this skill, you understand what it is that we're asking you to do when we sort of translate it, quote unquote, into, more Jamaican vernacular or patois, as we said. And so that was a bit of undertaking. But once we went through that part of the process, then it really was just a matter of everyone getting together and us shooting the videos. And then now the second stage really is now trying to get it distributed as wide as possible. So, again, thank you for this opportunity, because this is one other way now that person can learn about it. We have it on our YouTube page. We do share it via our social media. Whenever we do workshops, we do try to, as best as it's possible, we may use some of the videos depending on what the workshop is about, or at least provide a link so that people know that there is a resource that they can go to and that they can share. That's what's great about this, right? We're not keeping it, a secret. You can share it. Anyone who's listening to this podcast and goes to that YouTube page can share it amongst their friends, amongst their clients, if they're practitioners. It's not limited in its scope. Right. And so I think that is more of what we've been trying to do, to still, as our aim and our mission mentions, we want to create more trauma-informed Caribbean societies. And so though the videos exist, we do want to ensure that people are actually watching them and actually using the skills. And so we do want to, one of the upcoming projects that we have is using skills in these 2 schools, including one school for the deaf, right? And being able to sort of do a pre-test, post-test, kind of do a little bit of research on how these tools are being used and how they're being, how people are finding them useful, right? And so that's sort of the, I guess, second and third stage of doing this, because we don't want to just culturally adapt and then just send it out into the web, but we want to actually make sure that this is helpful and useful, and how is it helpful and how is it useful? Because then that also helps us to target certain things a bit more as we continue to grow in our organization.
Yeah. It really is. I think sometimes people think, oh, I'm just adapting it by translating the word itself and stop there. And that's really insufficient, because we need to think, well, is it actually producing the desired outcome? Are the clients that are using this, do they find it useful? There's so many, I guess, more programmatic evaluation thing that happens later on in the stage, which is why intervention treatment takes so long to create. Because you need to think about, as you're elucidating here, as you're highlighting every step, right? You're always adapting, revising.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I'm just amazed. I really am. I am in awe. Just this large undertaking essentially is, it's research. And so taking the skills that you've learned and making this accessible to a community is so key here. So, you shared this large undertaking and a huge commitment, with Kale, in addition to you, being involved with, APA as well as the Psychological Association in Jamaica. So, all this work and effort, can you share with me some of the memorable events or circumstances that influenced how you got into this work?
Well, my general interest in psychology really was born sort of towards the end of high school. And yes, it was that, sort of cliche general interest in why do we do the things that we do? Why do we behave the way we behave? And I sort of discovered that was psychology. And so that was what I was going to study. But with regards to trauma, that really grew out of my master's. With most master's programs, we do internships or practicum experiences. And there really was one particular case that stood out for me. To this day, I can still see the clients, but, she had an experience with, this is one of our ward rounds that was happening at one of the local hospitals. And this client, a young woman, had an experience with sexual violence, really, really, really traumatic. And her response to it It was almost bordering on catatonia. But the profound and the significant impact of it on her life and at her age as well really, really struck me. I was just very interested in, one, how do we help someone who is so severely traumatized get back to a level of not just functioning, but of, enjoying and living their life, right? And I think that was when the trauma aspect really stood out to me, and I carried it with me ever since. And so when the concept of trauma-informed care or being trauma-informed became more of a buzzword, I realized that this is sort of how I've always operated, maybe not formally so, based on, some of the definition, but it really was this recognition that trauma, one, can happen to anyone, and it can impact you in such a variety of ways, but also in such significant ways that can really alter the trajectory of your life. And if there's anything that I can do in my capacity as a psychologist, whether it's through clinical practice or involvement with helping persons, have a better understanding of trauma, whether that be clinicians or general public, then that is something that I want to be involved in. And so whether it's in my clinical work or in my professional sort of, again, involvement, we have an education committee and an educational branch, which is important for ensuring that clinicians get their continuing education, right? One, is important for licensure, but two, it gives an opportunity for providing more up-to-date, relevant information on various topics. And in particular for licensure, having CEs in trauma is mandatory. And so this is something that I get to be involved in, I get to help to oversee, right? So that's one way. And then also even in some of the broader sense, whether it's through CANPA, which is the Caribbean regional body, this is something, again, that we, through their conference, which, interestingly enough, at the time of our recording, it hasn't happened yet, but there is going to be a Caribbean Regional Conference of Psychology in Barbados. And this is where, psychologists from the Caribbean get to display and share that research that they're doing, right? And again, through JAMPsych, get to encourage our psychologists to not just, again, be practicing on the ground, but to really try and put together research. So we don't necessarily always see data coming up in the Caribbean, and this is an opportunity to present that amongst ourselves as well, and to develop Caribbean psychology. And so again, that's just another way that I get to be involved in the development of our profession, and in the Caribbean. And so that's just something I'm generally passionate about. And I know I'm kind of branching off from just trauma, but that is just generally something I am passionate about. And that's sort of how I guess found myself in some of these positions in some of these associations.
Yeah. Yeah. You've taken this, direct experience with a client, seeing the suffering, the impact from trauma. And there's something very clear in what you're saying here is moving beyond just functioning. Oftentimes we talk about treatment, impairment in functioning. Okay, well, that's fine. But it's like, how do you live? Right? Where's the willingness to live, the feel, the livelihood, right? The soul, the beauty. Okay, well,
the enjoyment and the
yes,
engagement with life and with others. Yeah.
I don't want to just function. I want to feel, I want to live. And so to be able to connect with that, and there's this love that you're conveying here in your message. And gosh, it's very energizing as well, because when you're talking about these conferences, you're engaging clinicians, and clinicians also want to be involved. And it's also a fantastic part of the licensure process, requires the trauma CEs. Different states here, have different requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's great that trauma is part of it. So in thinking about this journey, this path that you've taken in your career as a person of color, what were some challenges that you overcame and you would be willing to share?
Yeah, when you asked that question earlier, it's a tricky question for me, because I think in our setting, and we've spoken about this before in our setting, it's definitely not so much racial, but we do have a concept in Jamaica in particular, colorism, right? So, though majority of our population is Black, of course, there are various shades of Black, right? So we have very dark people, we have very light skin or light complexion people. And a lot of the historical discrimination that may occur tends to be along those lines. I mean, there are class lines as well, but along the sort of color lines in that sense. And so I think one of the things that I was thinking about, especially in terms of clinical practice, is recognizing I think, my own positioning in my society, and how sometimes that does give me privilege, right? I'm black, but I have certain phenotype, or phenotypical features that sort of give me a little bit of access to certain things that I can recognize, especially as an adult, other people may not necessarily have, just by virtue of sort of systemic, colorism that may exist. And I think for my own work, that was something that I had to recognize and appreciate and understand, because I would recognize when it would pop up with some of my clients, right? There may be clients who feel as though you can't relate at all to their experience because, in many ways their experience is very different from my own. And so again, when we're talking about cultural relevance and cultural understanding, it even speaks to just within our own, sort of countries or cities or cultural settings, because that person's experience is something that I have to learn to understand a little bit more, because it might not have been mine. But I also have to recognize how their perception of me in that setting may impact how they may be receiving, our treatment. And how is it that we maybe acknowledge and discuss that, and be open about it. Some clients have been very open about it, and so we can, right? Not all are as open about it, but it's something that I have to be sensitive and aware of as well. And I think that's something that we don't really think about as much when we're practicing, maybe here in Jamaica, and I'm saying that anecdotally. I have not, explored it statistically or anything like that. But I do think when we're talking about self-awareness in practice and competency and cultural awareness as well, those are some of the subtle and smaller things that I think are important for us to recognize and to try and figure out ways to overcome. How do I still connect with my client? Do I completely recognize that their experiences, will not be mine? When I suggest certain strategies or suggest ways in which they, should self-advocate, I have to understand some of the systemic issues that may cause them to have a very negative experience versus myself or maybe somebody else, right? Because of some of the things that exist systemically in our society, right? And for me, again, that's linked back to some of the professional work that I do, because again, through the professional society, we do have a policy committee. And, as much as it's possible, if we get the seats at the table to sort of involve ourselves in including, more psychosocial things in certain policies, these are some of the little systemic nuances that we do have to try and change, right? So it's bringing some of our clinical experience again to that broader population aspect. How do we help to create a more equitable society for all of our people through some of the things that we learn even from our small therapy rooms, right? And so I think that, and again, I'm sort of extending from your question, but that was something that I had to learn in terms of just self-awareness and overcoming that and understanding it and not taking offense to it either, right? If this is what the experience is like, this is what the experience is like, but understanding why that is helps me now and informs how I can try to relate and interact with my clients and be as useful as I can to my clients.
Yeah, it totally makes sense because if you're from Caribbeans, there's less of the racial contrast. And so then there is this, it's not as clear or evident as it is here in the States. And so I think asking that question, well, I do think about this. However, it's more in the maybe the framework of colorism, or SCS. And then also thinking about, well, if I were to suggest an intervention, wait, I can say, go do this thing, but then is my patient or client able to do that? Because what if they've faced multitudes of rejections or barriers in turn become demoralized? Who am I to suggest this intervention? Yeah, that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it feels out of touch.
Yeah, it feels out of touch. Thank you. Just put it bluntly, it feels out of touch. And taking that recognition and thinking about as a professional society, as well as clinicians, how do we think about that more deliberately? So for you, what does it mean to be a Caribbean psychologist?
Oh, that's such an all-encompassing thing, because I think the Caribbean is such, again, we use these terms melting pot, but it really is such a melting pot historically. And so we have influences and mixes of so many cultures here. So I do think of myself as a Caribbean psychologist, not just a Jamaican psychologist. And I think it means that the way we go about practicing is very integrated. It's not, I know a lot of people maybe you have a primary way of practicing, maybe it's CBT or, DBT or something like that. But really, it has always been very integrated. We have always incorporated, things from the arts, because those are things that resonate with Caribbean people, whether it's music or dance. And so, when some of these more, arts-based approaches became more formalized, you may have your art therapy or dance movement therapy, which are of course real and reputable, practices. But these are things that we've sort of intuitively been incorporating anyway, right? Because it's just part of our people and how we relate and how we understand, right? And I think, especially, in the past, a lot of those things probably would have been frowned upon from very traditional, psychologists and very traditional models. But for, being a Caribbean psychologist means that just as we are a melting pot of people, our practice is a melting pot of strategies and tools that are useful to our people. Because at the end of the day, that is the goal.
Wow. Love that. It's like we're a melting pot of people. And so our interventions should reflect that. Yeah. Yeah. So, Djavila, how can we support you?
With regards to Kale, I'd love everyone who's listening to this to go to our YouTube page, and it's Kale Journey. That's Kahle Journey. And check out the Tough It Out and Bill series, right? And that's the name of it, by the way. I don't even think I said the name earlier, all right? So it's the community resiliency model, but we've renamed it Tough It Out and Bill. So it's really working through that trauma and building resilience, right? And you can go through the videos, you can go through them one by one. You can go from the beginning, or you can just pick one if you want to, and really take a look at it, see how you feel in response to it, work through some of the strategies yourself and share them with other people. Absolutely. You can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, we are on LinkedIn, we are on TikTok. It's Kale Journey. Again, at those. And of course, if you are interested in, maybe learning a bit more or even collaborating, please feel free to send us an email, and we would be very happy to collaborate, because that's also something that we are very, big on, to collaboration. We don't see any reason why we have to do it all on our own. If there are entities that are interested in trying to do some of this work, we would be very happy to collaborate and do some work there as well. So I think those are a number of ways that people can really get on board and support.
Oh, fantastic. We'll definitely include the link to the video, how folks can contact you as well. Well, Djavila, any final thoughts?
No, I just really want to thank you, Jack, for this opportunity. It's a non-Caribbean platform in the sense that it helps us to get the word out even beyond our borders, and also to persons in the Caribbean diaspora, because sometimes they are a little disconnected to what's happening here, and hopefully this will reach a couple of those as well. As persons of color in many of these other countries, especially North America and European countries, I think this is one a little slice of home, but also you're learning a bit more about what's happening on the ground and maybe ways that you can get involved and still be connected to the work that's being done in Jamaica.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate this. And thank you so much, because, like you're saying, the US does not own psychology or mental health. Mental health is experienced by everyone, every country, it's the same, like you said, trauma is experienced by everyone. So we really need to get out of our comfort zone and start looking into how mental health treatment or mental health systems are developed and implemented in other countries, because gosh, it's then we just become too rigid and just looking at one way of doing things. And I don't know if psychology can continue to survive as a field if it doesn't actually adapt to the people. A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.